Hi, good morning. It looks like we have a small group today. Looks like there's only two of you so far. So hello to Kay and Tyler. Um, we only had 5 registered, so I think maybe the interest in these webinars is slacking. But I'm back. Hello, Tyler. I think Tyler, you've probably been on some of my webinars before, I believe. And we're going to be talking about stress today. So we'll see if some people join us. They may do that, but if not, then we'll go with who we have. So just briefly, an introduction about myself. My name is Madison Walsh. I'm a health promotion specialist from Halifax, and I'm also a registered dietitian and have a master's of public health. But today we're not talking about nutrition like I normally do. We're going to be talking about stress, just to do something a little bit different. So we'll jump right in. Before we get started, just a few things, as always, that we need to go through. So this presentation is the intellectual property of DND, so please don't try to reproduce these slides. Some topics in this webinar may be sensitive. Just use your own discretion if you have children present. Also understand that we're respecting each other's privacy, so if we do share anything in the chat, just to make sure that it stays within this webinar and not shared outside of the webinar. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and available online as always, so you'll be able to recommend it to your friends if you'd like, or go and watch it again yourself. So we just are going to do a quick statistics poll. There's not very many of you, so it should be quick, just to have an understanding of your role in the military. So I'm going to make that poll live now, and if you could share that with me, it would be great. It is completely anonymous, so it won't be connected to your own personal name. Looks like we've got one of you. So whoever hasn't, there we go. Okay, perfect. So we've got 1 serving and 1 veteran. Lovely. Wonderful. All right, moving on. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to turn my camera off so that we can see my slides in a larger form, and I'll come back on at the end if there's any questions. So I'd love to know what stress means to you and sort of what your definition of stress might be. So there is a chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're willing to share with me your thoughts about stress, then please do so in that chat. Of course, stress can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there can be a variety of ways that people view stress and experience stress. So again, there's no expectation that you share in the chat, but if you do feel like answering any of my questions or contributing, then by all means, please do that in the chat. All right, so I'll give you my definition of stress, and if you want to jump in and add anything on your own, then you can do that. So stress is basically an imbalance between the demands of your situation and your personal coping resources. So basically, it's when the pressure exceeds your perceived ability to cope with that pressure. So our perception is sort of how we perceive the event, either positive or negatively, and that actually has a bigger impact on how we respond than the event itself. So really, it's how we perceive what's going on and then how we react to it, and that relationship is really very important. Tyler, I see you say, it makes my head itchy. Interesting. I've never heard that one before. I get stressed when I think about not becoming self-sufficient. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. There's lots and lots of reasons that people experience stress, and that's certainly a very valid one. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, so types of stress. So we have 2 main types of stress, just to kind of give you a bit of a background on kind of what I'm talking about here. So we have eustress, which is sort of the positive type of stress. So for example, if you're experiencing an exciting challenge or opportunity. So for me, a huge part of my role is delivering courses. Right now, I'm only doing them online, but normally I am speaking in front of large groups, delivering courses or briefings or presentations. And as anyone would, you experience a little bit of stress before you're going up to do that sort of public speaking. That's a very common type of stress. Some people, when they experience that stress, it's quite negative. But for me, it's a positive form of stress. I get excited, but also a little bit nervous to talk in front of a group of people. So it's exciting for me, and it's a positive stress, and it actually ends up making me perform better. On the other hand, we have distress. So this one you may be much more familiar with. The word distress is used much more commonly because this is the negative form of stress. So for example, when you experience high demands, limited resources, or undesirable tasks, so it's not so much a positive thing on this end of things. So it becomes very overwhelming. And this is sort of the typical type of stress that people think of when they refer to stress. We often don't think about the positive type that can actually help us to achieve things, to feel excited about events, or to meet a deadline at work, things like that. That's where the positive type of stress comes in. So the stress response is an important aspect to consider when we're talking about stress. So we move sort of from the left to the right, and it starts out where an event or situation occurs. So that is your either internal or external stressor. So something has happened, you have maybe a really large project at work that needs to get done soon, and that's the event that's occurring that's posing the possibility of stress. Then we have our mental filter. So this is how we perceive the event, and that then becomes our reality. So it's basically the way that we interpret or judge the event, and this perception will fuel our stress. So how we perceive the event basically determines whether or not we end up feeling stressed about that particular situation or event. So it has a really big impact on how we respond to the event itself. And then lastly, we have a stress reaction. So basically can be either acute or chronic. So acute would be, sort of having a meltdown, feeling very overwhelmed, showing your emotions, or chronic could be just some long-term health effects that are as a result of your feeling stressed. But on the other hand, it's possible that you may have no stress reaction depending on how your mental filter has perceived the event. So if you are aware that you have a project that's due, but you know that you're capable of doing it, and you know you have the support of your staff to help you get through the stressful event, then you may not actually have a stress reaction at all. So it's really important to consider how we phrase the event and how we are perceiving what's going on in our lives. So to talk a little bit more about perception, because this is a really, really important aspect of stress, it can be based upon a lot of different things. So I have this cute little graphic there at the top corner. And as you can see, there's two men and they're seeing a number. And on one side, it looks like a 9, and on the other, it looks like a 6, just based on where you're standing. And I think this is a really great metaphor for perception in general. And it shows that each individual person may have a completely different perception depending on their view or their situation or where they are or who they are or whatever it is that's changed between the two people. So, for example, perception can be based upon past experiences. Let's say, as an example of that, maybe you received low grades in math in high school and you need to take a math competency for a test to apply for a new job. Well, you're probably going to be pretty stressed about that because you feel that maybe you're not going to succeed because you had a poor experience with math in the past. Present circumstances can also influence our perception. So if you're up all night with a sick child and now you're working all day on a project with a coworker that you dislike, you're probably more likely to feel stressed based on the circumstances of your life at that time. We can also perceive something as a danger or threat. So if something happens and you view it as dangerous or threatening, you're more likely to have a stress response. So if someone threatens you verbally, that's probably going to influence the way that you respond to that person if you're having a discussion with them. Next, how we perceive can be feeling a lack of control. So a common one, as a good example for this, would be air travel. So if you feel stressed at all when you're on an airplane, then that's often because of the lack of control, because you're not in control. You don't really understand the way that the plane flies, and you feel a little bit overwhelmed just by not being in control of the flight. Next, we have judging something to be a problem. So deciding ahead of time that something is just not going to work, it's already a problem before you've really had a chance to understand what's going on, that can really influence how you feel stressed. So it's important to try not to judge something before you have a chance to take in the situation. And lastly, jumping to conclusions about other people's motives can be another strong factor in our stress response. So perhaps you have a difficult conversation with a close friend, and then the next day they drive past you on the street and they don't wave. And you may jump to the conclusion that they are mad at you based on the conversation that you had, where it's actually possible that maybe they just didn't see you in the first place, or maybe they were distracted thinking about something else. So it's important to not try to jump to conclusions, or else that's going to lead to unnecessary stress. Okay, so here's a little graph that demonstrates the way that stress affects our performance. So I talked a little bit before about the positive and negative types of stress, so eustress and distress. And this graph really does a good job of explaining the ways that stress can either be positive or negative. So at the very bottom left corner, we have rest out. And basically, that's when you're asleep. So you're underinvolved, bored, frustrated, or just completely unconscious because you're sleeping. And that's kind of the absolute lowest level of stress that you can experience. You're very relaxed. You're just kind of not really involved in whatever's going on. Next, we move up and we start to reach a balance where we are becoming alert. So at this stage, we feel effective, we feel creative, and we're starting to be more aware of our surroundings. Then we have the optimal or peak. So the guy running up at the top of the curve there, that is the peak balance between stress and performance. So it's sort of a medium level of stress, but it actually really helps, like I said, to achieve results. If you have that little bit of stress, you're more likely to perform higher than if you're not stressed at all. Because the person who's not stressed at all is going to just be bored and, like I said, underinvolved, frustrated, and just not really able to achieve something if they feel completely lack of stress. So, excuse me, we do want a certain level of stress to be able to achieve results. But as soon as it starts to tip over onto the high side of stress, we start to see negative results. So things like anxiety and disorganization, reduced efficiency, reduced creativity and alertness, and we start to see some stress signals and warning signs. And eventually, we become burnt out. So when someone is burnt out, we see poor concentration, indecisiveness, irritability, anxiety, confusion, exhaustion. Basically, that person is just not capable of doing a whole lot. They're just totally tapped out and they start to shut down. And at that point, we're not going to see a high performance, if any performance at all. So if you consider that at work, if someone has received way too much and is incapable of completing it all, they're going to be so stressed out that they're just going to shut down and stop working altogether. And it gets very frustrating. All right, so another question for you, if you feel that you would like to share, again, no pressure, but I would be curious to know what your main sources of stress are. So those could be your current sources of stress, maybe some sources of stress in the past that you'd like to share. Again, no pressure, but it is interesting to see the different variety of sources of stress in different people. I know we probably all have one in common these days with the pandemic. That alone is is often quite stressful, and it's a difficult thing to be going through. But we all kind of are going through it at the same time, so we have that shared experience, which does help. But there is a huge, wide variety of different types of stress in different types of people. So I'll throw some out here for you. On the left, we have external sources of stress. So external sources of stress include things from the physical environment, your social environment, so your friends and family, things like major life events, so weddings, divorces, maybe a big birthday, having a close friend or family member pass away, having a child, losing a job. All of these types of things are external stressors, and quite big ones, really. We also see small little stressors like those daily hassles that really become very irritating and lead to a fair amount of stress. For example, waiting in traffic, losing something, trying to find a parking spot at Stadacona. For those of us from Halifax, if anyone is, you'll know that it can be very challenging, and I'm sure other bases have very similar experiences with finding parking. So little things like that can actually lead to large amounts of stress. And lastly, we see external sources of stress in institutional or organizational examples. So dealing with bureaucracy at work or at school or in a hospital or with the government, having to follow rules and regulations that perhaps you don't agree with or you find frustrating, sticking to a schedule that's given to you, having to go to meetings, all kinds of things like that can be really huge sources of stress for a lot of people. Then we have internal sources of stress. So when we're talking about internal sources, they're sources that come from within. So from within the person, either you or someone else. So, for example, lifestyle choices like your health habits. So whether you smoke cigarettes or have caffeine or alcohol, these types of things can result in different forms of stress. Maybe you have a poor work-life balance. That could lead to stress. Financial choices that you've made, or perhaps you're feeling socially isolated. A lot of us probably are these days, and that can be an internal source of stress. We also see a lot of negative self-talk within a huge majority of the population. This is very common, and basically what we mean by that is your internal monologue. So you're talking to yourself in a negative way. So you're being overly critical or judgmental of yourself and of your choices, thinking things like, oh, I should have done this, or I have to do this, or what was I thinking when I did that? You're over-analyzing every single decision, you're second-guessing yourself, and that can really build up and take a toll on our mental health and lead to a large amount of stress. We also see mind traps. So a mind trap is an unrealistic expectation. So basically, if you take things too personal, you're exaggerating, taking on other people's problems, you're basically just forcing yourself into a trap where you ought to feel stressed, even though there's really not necessarily a need for that. And lastly, personality types. I'm sure we all know someone who has a personality that just does not work with our personality, and that can cause a great deal of stress. Maybe you're a little bit of a more relaxed personality and you have a coworker who's a workaholic and they always want to be talking about work and need to know your opinion on everything at all times of the day. That can be very, very frustrating when those personalities don't match up. All right, so symptoms of stress. Huge variety of symptoms, and I think we all have a rough idea basically that stress does have some negative health effects on our body. So we see a variety of physical symptoms. So shortness of breath, heavy breathing, muscle tension, headaches, sometimes even heartburn or upset stomach. These are all immediate, acute symptoms that we can see if someone's feeling very stressed, then oftentimes these will show themselves. On the other side, we have a variety of behavioral symptoms. So your stress may come out in your eating patterns. It may come out with substance abuse or use, like alcohol or tobacco, grinding your teeth, biting your nails, neglecting your appearance, or procrastinating. These are just a few examples. Of course, there's lots, and you may have some thoughts yourself of different types of symptoms that happen to you if you're feeling overly stressed. And to continue on, we also have cognitive and emotional symptoms of stress. So in the cognitive side, things like poor concentration, memory lapse, negative attitude, confusion, and worrying. So really, just having those mental blocks and symptoms that come as a result of stress. And on the emotional side, things like nervousness, anxiety, irritability, crying easily or becoming overly emotional, impatience, and sensitivity. So all of these things can happen as a result of the feeling of stress. So why is it important that we manage stress? Well, of course, we can then avoid all of those different symptoms that we just talked about. And the more that we practice healthy stress management and try to manage our stress on a daily basis, the more that we can handle life's demands. So it's important to learn to recognize your stress signals and find effective coping strategies that will help you to improve your health and your quality of life. So learning about these stress signals will also help you to recognize when someone else is showing too much signs of stress. So we want to manage our stress not only for ourselves, but for others. It's really important to be able to recognize those signals and find effective coping strategies, coping methods, so that we can try to avoid some of those health symptoms from occurring to ourselves or our loved ones. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the stress hormones, and these may sound a bit familiar to you if you've learned about this in school in the past. So the first thing that we'll mention is the fight, flight, or freeze kind of instinct. So when a person feels that they are under stress, we release adrenaline and cortisol, and those help us in an immediate crisis. And they help us to do one of three things. We either decide to fight, flight, or freeze. So basically, fight, flight, or freeze. So we're making a decision on how we want to deal with this stress. So adrenaline is a short-term hormone related to acute, so your fight, flight, or freeze stressors. So you may have experienced in the past an adrenaline rush where that hormone is really taking over and controlling how you react in the time of stress. So it helps us to deal with an immediate crisis or a short-term stressor, like a car accident, perhaps. It increases your heart rate and your rate of breathing to increase the blood supply and oxygen to your muscles so that you can react more quickly. It helps to reduce blood flow to your skin and to the other body functions that are non-essential. So that way you can have your more essential body functions, like running away if you need to. And it quickly breaks down, it is quickly broken down by the body so that their effects do not last. So your adrenaline and cortisol, it is short-term effect. So these are really important in those really short-term stress. And these types of hormone reactions are, they've existed for a long time. So although the types of stress that we interact with these days, like a car accident or something at work, feeling overwhelmed, are not perhaps the types of stress that these hormones are meant for. Typically, they were meant for actually fighting or running away from another animal trying to attack you way back when all of our modern day luxuries didn't exist. So sometimes these hormones actually are unnecessary, and they result in these types of reactions when we don't necessarily want to feel that way because there's no immediate threat, but our body just perceives that there is because we do feel stressed. Then we talk about chronic stressors. So as opposed to those immediate stressors where we have that fight, flight, or freeze response, now we'll talk about chronic. So chronic is sort of a long-term type of stressor that may have a longer-term effect. So in this case, we have a longer-term hormone that is released for chronic stress, and it's called cortisol. So this hormone is released over a prolonged period of time and has ultimately quite damaging effects on the body if it is continued to be released over time. So it is released in response to respond to high levels of adrenaline, and then it helps to regulate your blood pressure, return your breathing back to normal, and normalizes your blood flow, which is a good thing because it helps us to deal with the aftermath of a stressful situation. But the problem with cortisol is that when the stress is prolonged, we maintain higher levels of this hormone in our system. So then this carries long-term risks for our overall health, including things like heart disease. So it's really important that when we feel stressed, that we try to use our coping mechanisms as early on as possible to avoid the prolonged release of cortisol and to avoid those negative health effects. So here we have some of the health effects of chronic stress. So we already mentioned a few of the symptoms of stress, but those were a bit more short-term. So now we're going to look at the long-term chronic health effects that can result from stress. So number one, we have the musculoskeletal system. So we see long-term effects like increased muscle tension. So you'll often hear of people complaining of sore shoulders and backs when they are stressed for a long time, and things like headaches and migraines. Secondly, we see effects in the cardiovascular system. So we see negative effects like hypertension, potential heart attacks, strokes, and high cholesterol. Thirdly, we have the endocrine system, where we see an impaired immune system function as a result of stress and potential immune disorders. We see chronic fatigue. It's very common for someone who is under chronic stress to be always tired. And metabolic disorders such as obesity or diabetes. And lastly, we see effects in even the reproductive systems. So we see reduced testosterone production and a reduced ability to become pregnant. So this is an interesting one. It's often very common that if a couple is very stressed about wanting to have a baby, that just actually makes it less likely that they will become pregnant. So it's more likely that you'll have success in having a baby if you're not feeling stressed about anything in your life, or even actually about the fact that you're trying to have a baby. It's better to just relax and kind of let it do its thing. So the body reacts in weird ways. So hopefully from this slide, you can see that really stress can impact almost all parts of our body, and it can have negative effects pretty well everywhere that we look. It can make us more prone to infection and illness, can lead to an inability of sleep, which really leads to a lot of negative effects if we're not sleeping well, can cause weight gain. So lots and lots of potential negative effects. So, of course, learning how to manage stress does have a positive impact. It's really important, and it does help to mitigate some of these health effects that we've just discussed. So we're going to talk now about stress management. So again, if you feel like sharing, feel free to do so on how you currently manage your stress. So I do find it interesting. Everyone often has their own individual ways of managing their stress. Some find their own ways very effective. Others perhaps are not as good at managing their stress and are always looking for new ways to manage their stress. So we are going to talk about a few different ways that are fairly simple to do that we can use starting today to help to manage our stress. And we're going to look into those here in a minute. So the four methods that we're going to talk about for different stress management techniques. And we have the personal power grid, tactical breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and meditation and mindfulness. So we're going to talk about each one of these briefly, and then you can take these strategies home with you and practice them and see if they help you to decrease your stress. And just a reminder, the reason that we want to do these types of stress management techniques is to try to tackle the stress as early on as possible to avoid that prolonged release of cortisol and those negative health effects. It also just really doesn't feel good to be stressed. I don't think I've ever met someone who tells me that they like being overly stressed. Maybe a little bit, some of that eustress, the positive stress is okay, but when it becomes negative, then it's not very helpful and people don't like it. So it's important to try to use these types of strategies to manage our stress as early on as possible. So here we have the personal power grid. So this is basically just a way of thinking about what we have control over in our life and what we don't have control over. So if we look at this chart, it's kind of outlined here. We have the green and the red. So if we line up take action with control, then what we get is mastery. So if you are taking action on something that you have control over, then that means that you're mastering that situation. As an example, so this power grid is about making choices to accept or create a vision or to take action. In the real world, there are a few things that are so black and white that it's more likely shades of gray, but it can be helpful to think of stressors into these groups and focus on our time and energy on the stressors that we can influence. So this is all about realizing what we have control over and what we should influence and what we shouldn't bother with. So we'll kind of go through an example here. And the example that I've outlined is looking for a new job. So you're hunting for a new job, you're looking in the job market, and this is kind of the situation that we will be taking through this personal power grid. So when we look at the mastery quarter, this is something that we have control over and we've decided to take action. So for example, you decide to take action over something that you control, like applying to new jobs. So you know that you want a new job, you know that you're not happy in your current position, and so you know you have control over that, so you're taking action by putting your application in and applying for new jobs. If we look at the take action and no control section, then that leads us to what's called hanging on. So this is when we persist at taking action on activities that we have no control over and we cannot influence. So for example, if you applied for a job and got rejected and you continue to pester that HR rep to try to convince them that they should hire you, that is kind of hanging on to that particular job and not moving on to the next challenge. So that's really not a positive thing to do. We don't want to hang on to things that we can't control. We want to move on, accept that as a learning experience, and move on to the next challenge. Next, we'll look at the section where we have control and we don't take action. So this is known as quitting or giving up. So basically, we're not taking action on something that we do have control over. So for example, you know that you hate your job, you really want to move on from it, but you don't bother applying for any more jobs because you haven't had success in the past, and you don't think that you could get another job even if you tried. So this is really a negative place to be as well. And lastly, something that we have no control over and we don't take action on, this is called acceptance. So we really shouldn't be trying to influence things that are beyond our control. So for example, moving on from an application that didn't work out rather than hanging on to it and pestering that HR representative. So accepting that, you know, this one wasn't for me, I'm going to keep trying and move on from that. So I just find that this personal power grid is an important thing to keep in your mind whenever you feel like you might be a little bit stressed or unsure of what's going on and not sure what to do about it. Try to run it through this little grid. See if it's something that you have control over or not, and then you can decide whether or not it's worth taking action on. And that can help us to control our stress. So just to summarize, acceptance is an important part of improving your stress management skills. You can either have no control or some level of control over a stressor. So it's important to accept what you can and cannot control, and that will help to minimize the stress that you feel. So your personal power lies within your ability to make choices, and we need to choose whether or not we're going to try to control that stressor, if it is something that we control, and master it, or if it's something that we want to just accept is something that we cannot control and move on from it. So those are the two zones that we want to try to stay within. All right, our second strategy for for stress reduction is tactical breathing. So tactical breathing is meant to improve your ability to moderate your stress response through the use of mindful breathing. And practicing this technique can actually help to lower your heart rate and your blood pressure. So, this is a common one, and I think people probably have fairly good understanding of the fact that deep breathing and slow breathing, it's a very common thing that people suggest when they talk about when they're feeling stressed and how to reduce that feeling of stress in the moment. So it's a very simple concept. Basically, you want to inhale to a count of 4, hold for 4 seconds, and then exhale for 4 seconds. And repeat this at least 10 times or until you feel relaxed. And it may sound kind of silly, but if you have not ever tried this, I highly recommend that you do. If you find yourself getting worked up and upset and very stressed about whatever it is that's happened in your life, give this a try. Take, a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, it's all it takes, and focus on your breathing. Just try to calm your mind, focus on your breathing, and think about it. There is other counts that you can do. Thank you, Florin. Definitely you can do 4-7-8, 4-4-4, whatever works for you. But all that really matters is that you're controlling a slow breath and focusing on that breath. Yeah, Tyler, I think that's really common too, is that people will try it and feel like it's not working and kind of move on and continue to feel stressed. So maybe next time, really try to power through and see if it works. It may not work. Sometimes, there's some people that it just don't find that this works for them. But if it does work for you, then that's a great strategy. It's really easy. You can do it anywhere. No one will even notice that you're doing it. And if it can help, then all the better. And it definitely can help for sleep as well. That's a great point. If you're having trouble falling asleep, this is something that can help you to fall asleep. Because often, part of the reason why we struggle to fall asleep is we have so much on our minds and we're thinking about the next day and all the stressful things that are coming up. So again, it really is just a way of monitoring that stress and managing it. And yes, closing your eyes is helpful as well. Very good point. Thanks, Megan. Great. Okay, up next, we have progressive muscle relaxation. So this practice is really helpful for you to become more aware of where you hold tension in your body. So basically, the general concept behind this stress reduction strategy is to deliberately hold tension in a muscle group and then release it. You repeat that throughout your entire body, and it improves your ability to reduce the muscular tension as soon as it starts. So if you are deliberately tensing up a certain muscle group and then you relax it, you'll actually feel more relaxed than when you started, because you may have been already holding tension there. So if you just add tension and then relax completely, you'll find that it kind of releases that muscle tension, and that can really help to reduce our levels of cortisol and reduce our stress. Another way, the way that I actually originally learned this was from my mother, and she used to call it the rag doll. So rather than holding tension, so squeezing, we would just wiggle. So we would wiggle our hands, like, wiggle, 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 and then we would make it go limp. And she always said, limp like a rag doll. So make your hands go completely limp. And then we'd move on to our arms and wiggle, wiggle, wiggle your arms, and then make them go limp. So that can be a way that you can think of it as well. If you don't like the tension aspect of it, you can just try to kind of wiggle those muscles, and try to do as many of the muscle groups as you can. You can start from head to toe. So your face muscles, your neck muscles, your arm and hand muscles, your abdominal muscles, and then down your legs all the way to your feet. So try to really break it down in as small of muscle groups as you possibly can and go all the way throughout your body. And at the end, you will very likely feel less stressed and more relaxed, and also you will likely have lower levels of cortisol in your body. Okay, up next is meditation and mindfulness. So some of you may have tried meditation before, or even just mindfulness. Basically, it's the ability to be fully present, to be aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not to become overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us. So, it doesn't have to be a full-on meditation for it to be successful. Some people tend to get a bit intimidated by the word meditation, because it can be potentially difficult to achieve full meditation for some people. But really, it's just important to allow yourself to be mindful of what's going on and mindful of how you're reacting to the situation and what that stress response is doing. So how we can do this is setting aside some time. All you need is about 5 or 10 minutes at the most. And you can observe the moment as it is and become fully aware of the present. So just sit there and allow yourself to be present. You will find that your thoughts drift in and out. You may be thinking about things that you have to do later on that day. But when you do notice that, it's fine. You just accept that thought, put it aside for a little while, and focus back to the present moment. So this practice it seems simple, but it's not necessarily easy. So maybe this evening before you go to bed, give it a try, see how you do. It does take practice. It can be quite difficult to be so present and not always thinking about what's going on tomorrow or where you have to be or what your kids need from you next. So practice makes it easier, and it does take time, but it is a very enjoyable practice once you get used to it, and it really can help to reduce your levels of stress. Okay, so just as a summary, we're almost done here for the day. So stress is a normal part of life, and it can be both positive or negative. So our perceptions are the main fuel for stress. The way that we view the trigger is how we end up reacting to that trigger. And everyone sees things differently. So it's important to recognize that our perception is different than someone else's, and someone may be reacting to the same stressor in a completely different way than you. Short-term stress is healthy and can allow us to perform that positive eustress that I talked about, but long-term negative distress can cause significant damage to our health, both physical and mental. Lastly, there are many different ways that we can manage stress. Stress management is a skill that needs to be practiced. We talked about a few here today. I would encourage you to give some of them a try at home on your own if you have some time, maybe later today or tonight, and see how they work for you. And if you would like to learn more, I know at CFB Halifax, we are just starting to plan to start to deliver some in-person courses. So we have a course called stress.com. You probably have very similar courses in your bases. I know some other bases call it Stress Take Charge. So it's all really the same concept. We just sort of adapt it according to the needs of our base. But it is a more in-depth summary of different types of stress management and how we can control our stress. So a lot of the same types of information, but more in depth. So if you're interested in learning more, then maybe explore whether that's a possibility at your base if they are delivering in-person courses in the near future, which hopefully we all will be doing soon now that things are starting to become a little bit more normal with the pandemic situation. So that's exciting. All right, so we have one last poll here. I will make it live now. If anyone joined, I think we now have 4. So if you joined, if you could just make sure you answer the last poll that I put as well about your military status, you can find that there. And then I'm going to make this one live. And I just love to know if you feel that you can apply what you've learned today in your daily learning or your daily living, sorry. So if you wouldn't mind everyone answering that, like I said before, it is completely anonymous, so it will not be linked to your name. So I would really appreciate if everyone gave me their feedback on that. It really does help us to make these webinars as good and relevant as we can. So it looks like we've had 3 of you. So there should be one more person. If you wouldn't mind giving me an answer, I'd really, really appreciate it. In the meantime, thank you so much for attending this webinar. I know we had a bit of a small group, but I do appreciate you guys joining me today. Hopefully you learned something. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. I'll just put my video on here again so I can say bye. So thanks so much again, everyone. You can feel free to sign off now. And hopefully we'll see you again soon if I end up doing another webinar. I'm not sure if I will or not, it depends on the need, but this was fun. So thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.